Very good. Okay, what a joy. Welcome, everybody.
Hello.
I'm Mattie Kahn from ELLE magazine. I am sure that we are going to get into the many ways the fashion industry must improve. But let's start on a somewhat positive note. I want to ask each one of you sort of how over the past, let's say, 2 to 3 years, because I don't really think it's more than that, first of all, you noticed a sea change was beginning to happen in this industry, and the moment at which you said, I could be part of this, and I can push it forward. So actually, Andreja, I'm going to put you on the spot and start with you.
How, can you, sorry, I didn't hear that question.
Yeah, sure. I wonder at what point you realized that the industry was beginning to change, or open to change, and you felt like I could be part of that change and push it forward.
Yeah. Well, when I started my career, it was in 2010. 2009, 2010, and so gender was, or the fluidity, you know, the gray area in between male and female, and was being explored in fashion for a long time, I think, in some way or another, but often in a fetishized kind of way. And I don't think it had gone as mainstream as it has gone now. To have walked both men's and women's shows, you know, that was a very, I got a lot of media attention for that because it was such a unique thing in the industry. Whereas now you see fashion shows and they include both, you know, male models and female models, and then you have brands marketing unisex clothing, and, you know, it is a very, you know, to divide fashion into men's wear and women's wear is a, you know, it's probably an outdated way of looking at things. Because, you know, boys want to wear dresses and girls want to wear suits, and there's nothing wrong with that, you know what I mean? So why, and, you know, for an industry that's supposed to be at the forefront of cultural change, why should it hold on so fiercely to the gender divide, I guess?
Right. And Sarah, Kate, for you, obviously GLAAD's been doing this work for a really long time in this industry, but also just doing media advocacy for a really long time. How do you perceive what is being talked about as a moment? Is that accurate? Is this a moment of sea change, or do you see it differently?
Well, GLAAD has been doing this for about 32 years, and I think that fashion is so important because it's one of the cultural institutions that sets the future, right? It really does lead the way. And so even if you think back to the 90s in America and Calvin Klein and the gender fluidity that was in those ads, those underwear ads, fashion has been there in a way. It just hasn't put all of its chips in. And so now I think they're finally putting all their chips in, and they need to, because fashion is youth, and youth is fashion. And if you look at Gen Z, what we define in America as Gen Z, 40% of Gen Zers don't want to live on a binary.
Right.
So if fashion is youth and youth is fashion, fashion needs to catch up to the kids, and start leading the way. And fashion has always been a cultural leader. So I'm surprised at a way that it took this long, but I also think we don't give them enough credit for how far ahead they have been as well. So there's a dichotomy going on there.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, for me, fashion is what's on the streets. It's what the kids wear. You know what I mean? And it's and so because even the high fashion industry, which is supposed to be, you know, the you know, the leader of taste and whatever, it's a business. It's a very monopolized business that, you know, sometimes takes longer to I think, innovate or change because you have the money people who want, you know, a lot of profits, and then, you know, I think that stands in the way sometimes. You know, but there is a vibrant creative community that does want to, you know, throw away the shackles of gender identity, you know what I mean?
Right.
Because what is gender at the end of the day?
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to move past, I guess.
Yeah.
And I want to know, of course, how an institution like the British Fashion Council thinks about those changes. And and pushes the industry, in many ways toward what's best for them from the consumer perspective and from an ethical and societal perspective?
Well, I think is that we look at it through a lens of London and what we can affect in terms of British fashion. And I think is that as an industry, we should be proud. We're probably one of the industries that is the most diverse and most open. Doesn't mean to say that we're there, is that there's definitely more that we could do. But there is an opportunity for us to lead the way. And when we think about London Fashion Week and the British fashion community, is that London is seen as one of the most diverse, multicultural cities in the world. And so when we're talking to designers is that we very much remind them as part of the casting around fashion weeks that they should think about that, and they have a global customer, they have a very diverse customer, and they need to think about that as part of their casting because that's their end consumer. They're also incredibly creative, as you said, and they do want to challenge the norms of society. They do want to challenge sort of the hyper-feminine or hyper-masculine perceptions of beauty. And I think there's a real opportunity for them to do that through the magazines, through working with great creative directors. We have a really great sort of young magazine scene in the UK, and often that's used as a testing ground to be able to sort of really collaborate and to start challenging some of those perceived norms.
Right. I mean, I'm thinking of the latest British Vogue cover, which everyone's very excited about. And isn't the cover model a British Fashion Council ambassador?
She is. I'm very proud to say is that Adwa came on board this year to really help us push the agenda around diversity. And Adwa has a great platform herself, which is called Girls Talk, which is really thinking about talking around some of the challenges that we have as women, but also some of the challenges that you have as a young person.
Right.
And I think is that, again, is that we feel really fortunate in the UK is that we have a lot of young talent. We're known to be sort of this birthplace for emerging talent. And you see where maybe some of the more established businesses are really, they know that they have to think about diversity, and it's a conscious decision that they're thinking about it. But the young businesses that we work with is that it's the norm to them, is that, if you think of designers like Charles Jeffrey and Molly Goddard and art school, is that for them this is the world in which they live in, and they show that through the casting, they show that through the presentation of their shows, and that's really exciting to see.
Yeah, I think that is sort of that generational divide is thrilling. I mean, we're talking a lot about the runways and the casting, and obviously, like all of you have said, that's what sets the tone for what people think is cool. But there's the other side of things, which is that, like you also said, fashion is happening in the street. It's happening among people who are creating their own worlds all the time. I'm interested, Sarah, Kate, then why I know that you guys just partnered with ASOS on a gender-neutral collection. Why they felt like a natural partner for you guys, and what the visibility of a collection like that is meant to do.
Yes, well, so they target youth. They're a youth-oriented brand. They're a British brand. They are sold exclusively online. So all of those things are in line with our brand. But more so is that the campaign that we built that around is an ampersand, an N sign. And that really is about marginalized communities coming together in diversity and inclusion. And so, as we talk about this, and they're all available online, so please go and buy them, and they're really
very
cool and chic.
Yeah.
But I think what's so important is it's a lot of the discussion that's happening here at Web Summit, right, is about diversity, especially in Silicon Valley, right? And so, you could talk about an industry that's on the cutting edge or is leading, which is technology and digital, but is not built off of, at its core, diversity, right? And so I think when we think of fashion, it's embedded in fashion, the creatives. I've worked at Vogue, I've been at InStyle in my lifetime, and so the artists that work there are so creative. And in the creative industry, by saying creative industry, it usually is diverse, right? But doing the 360, putting that woman on the cover, is now a new step. It's in front, like we say in Hollywood too. It's in front of the camera and behind the camera. It's at all the tables, not just one table. And that's really important as we think about fashion and the influence and the impact that it has, and how it's going to continue to evolve and be a leader in culture.
Yeah, well, you've perfectly set me up for my next question, which is obviously fashion and beauty too are these hyper visual mediums. But we want to make sure in these conversations that we're adding nuance, that we're not being one dimensional about what diversity means.
Yeah.
And Andrea, I know that you've encountered that before in the sense of maybe sometimes feeling tokenized by some of the
For sure.
movements.
Well, I think that the company, a lot of companies are realizing now that diversity is profitable, which is why I think that it's going mainstream. But I think that it needs, you can really see when a company is being, or your creative person is being authentic or just trying to hop on the diversity bandwagon. And, you know, as a transgender model, you know, I do feel like sometimes a lot of the you know, the offers I get and the bookings I get, it's like, it feels like a charity donation a little bit. You know, let's like bring this trans person in to see how progressive we are. But the thing is, it's like we want to be evaluated like anyone else, like based on our work and our talent.
Right.
Which I think gets overlooked if you are different, if you know, tick off a certain box. And I mean, I don't want to be, I mean, you know, to be excluded because of my gender history or medical history or gender identity is not a nice feeling. It's a horrible feeling. To be included just because of that is, it's better, but it's not that much better. You know what I mean? Like it still feels like, you know, you do feel like a novelty. But, you know, I'm very grateful for the opportunities I've had. I mean, like you know, have a pretty nice life. You know, I can't complain too much. So, you know, I do think that it is shifting. I would say that, you know, the young people and people in general are moving a bit faster, and then the companies are catching up. But yeah, I don't think it's rocket science. I really think it's just about looking at people for what they are, people, you know, and looking at people who are from diversities the same way as people, as creatives, as people with talent, you know. So, yeah, onwards and upwards.
Yeah, and Caroline, do you feel like you ever have to sort of run point in terms of taking companies gently by the hand and sort of making that point to them that it's not enough to tick a box, that there's a more holistic way to look at what diversity means?
Yeah, I mean, for us, diversity definitely isn't box ticking. This is about reflecting the society that we live in, reflecting the city we live in, reflecting the audience that the businesses are selling to. And is that I do feel with the designers that we work with is that they're very authentic, they're very genuine, and I think particularly the young designers are very earnest about that. And they want to make sure that they're reflecting their friendship group, the society they feel that they're part of. And I do feel that going forward, they're not going to take no for an answer in thinking about how that's represented, whether it's through campaigns or magazines or on the runway.
Right. And for you, Sarah Kate, when you're doing advocacy work or when media companies bring GLAAD in and say, help us, you know, what sort of advice do you find yourself giving over and over again? Where do you think if they finally listen to you, things might look actually a little bit different?
Right. I always say, call me first, don't call me after. You can always call me after in the middle of a crisis calm situation. I'll answer then too, but I prefer the call earlier. And what I say oftentimes is that I do think in this day and age, more so than not, people operate from the positive. Like, people want to do the right thing. That doesn't necessarily mean that they know what the right thing is. And so what I always say is, like, look at the world and reflect the world. It's not that complex, right? If you
Right.
look at what our world looks like 51% of our world are women. So make sure women are in there and making the decisions. 20% now with millennials identify as LGBTQ. So make sure you're representing them as well. And I think fashion had a bigger opportunity that it lost along the way.
Right.
I really do. And I think they're paying the price for it now. And what that is that they're playing catch up when they could have been in a leadership position. The kids aren't going to wait for them. They have no reason to. They can design on their own. They can create on their own. And so now I feel like if fashion's really going to continue to be a cultural force, it's got to really step on the accelerator now.
Yeah, because 3 years ago when I came out, I had a career as an androgynous model, and then I came out, finished my transition into womanhood. I came out publicly. I was actually dropped by a modeling agency. So that was only 3 or 4 years ago. So that's
And
what
say who represents you now.
Sorry.
Say who represents you
And now I'm with Ford.
Yeah.
So life's good, but it took that time for to push and push for people to see you and respect you, and you've got to prove yourself twice as hard.
Right, at every point. I think, Sarah Kate, you were there with the apt metaphor in front of the camera and behind the camera, especially with the conversations that we're having in the US right now about safety for women in particular, but for men and women really at work, and what sexual harassment looks like across many different industries. I don't think we can have a conversation about ugliness in fashion without talking about the fact that to this day, really, it's a lot of men making a lot of choices and creating environments that are either unsafe or unfriendly for the talent, for models in particular. What do you think representation means in the sense of changing that dynamic and making sure that as we're defining a culture, which fashion so does, we're putting out a culture that's safe and supportive and still very cool?
Right. So I think actually Ronan Farrow's new article in the New Yorker is quite insightful, not only from the web that was created around Weinstein and all the misgivings that happened there, but sort of the enabling, right?
An
and
apparatus
how
of
within each
enabling.
industry, not only do we enable sexual harassment, how do we enable the norm, right? Like, we've taken on constructs in fashion, in every industry that we just get used to because it's the way you do business. Well, with Silicon Valley and all the disruptions that's happening now and the disruption on sexual harassment, how do you now reshape why wait for a tragedy to reshape your norms within your industry? Set the standard. And that's where I think fashion could really be a leader. And they haven't stepped up yet, but I think that there is a call for them to be a leader in this, in that don't have something tragic happen in order to then to look at the way that you've set up your infrastructure.
Right.
And these are so the enabling infrastructure is also is a silent infrastructure, right? It's not something that's on paper. It's not a model, a business model. And so you have to be really smart to look at that and see how you're going to disassemble that.
Right. Transparency is collaboration.
Right.
Yeah, please.
I think is that every industry is looking at, they're looking at what's happening in Hollywood, and they're sort of looking at their own industry and saying, so what can we do better? How do we make sure that people just aren't put in a position where they feel at risk or there's an opportunity for any kind of abuse of power? And I'm with you. I very much hope that the fashion industry will step up. We certainly have started those dialogues to look at what can be done. And it just needs to feel that it's okay to say it's not okay.
Right.
And everyone needs to take account of the fact that whether it's models or actresses, these are individuals who are employed. There's a big organization with a corporate governance structure that would not accept this, that is employing individuals, and they need to take account of that as they would for any of their other employees.
Yeah, well, with what's happening with the Harvey case, I think that's pretty common thing in fashion industry. Really, you know, abuse is, you know, it happens. It happens to female models. It happens to male models. Sometimes actually happens to male models even more, I would say. But you know, obviously it depends what background and what class you come from. I mean, you know, girls that, you know, come in from Eastern Europe without parents and, you know, are sent over to London and Paris to build a better life, you know, they're much more exposed, you know, at 14, at 16, to these sort of predators or just people that abuse their power. And I think, you know, that's the saddest thing. But it's one of those things, it's like when you give people power, they abuse it, you know, and yeah.
Not unless it
But that
costs
should never
them.
be
If it
acceptable.
costs them,
Right, unless it costs them, yeah.
Right, and that's what you're starting to see. Careers are coming down, money is being lost, and
Right.
so when that starts to happen, you can start to change the way these power dynamics work. But I think you have a really good point, which is, you know, these models are incredibly vulnerable. And you know, I say this about Hollywood, and I think the same about the fashion industry. There's no HR department for Hollywood, right? And so we're in a company in and of itself. You function with an HR department. These things happen because there's for many reasons, and one of them is that there's no oversight.
Right.
And so how does this industry police itself? And where in the fashion industry are the leaders stepping up to say, we're going to form this council to put together a code of ethics that we're then going to enforce in terms of, you know, access and privilege within the industry?
Well, I think a lot of this conversation has been about public accountability and what
Yeah.
it means to have a public consumer base that says, you know, we care about this, and if you aren't meeting our standards, it's not just our standards and what we want to wear. If you're not the kind of people we want to literally do business with,
Yeah.
we won't do business with you. And I think that that is something that's maybe even more powerful than we yet realize as these younger generations assume more and more buying power. I guess we'll just
Absolutely.
finish with, because we're out of time, sadly, if you could put something on your wish list for the next year, and let's limit it to 1 year, what do you want to see when we're back here in a year have changed from now till then in the industry in particular? And Caroline, we'll start with you.
So I always look at it in terms of what role we can play in terms of affecting change. And there's two things. One is I would love London to be #1 capital for diversity. I think is that we should absolutely own it. If there is any city that could, we should, and hope to play a part in that. We'll play a part in making it happen. And the second is that there is a code of practice established. I think is that as an industry, we should take accountability, and I hope that will be able to be done sooner rather than later.
Yeah. And for you?
I hope to see accountability that is those who are doing the positive are being rewarded, and those where the negative infrastructure is being disassembled.
I would love to see a transgender model on the cover of American Vogue.
Oh, that would be nice.
Yeah.
That would be fabulous.
Not because she's trans, but because she deserves it and she's built up a career. So, or, you know, doing Victoria's Secret or something very like mainstream like that. Yeah, because I do think that fashion has a cultural significance and a role to play. It's not just about selling clothes. It can push things forward. It can change the way how people perceive things and what's chic and what's not. So I do think it has a responsibility.
Yeah, and I think to your point about the cover of a magazine, I mean, these magazines, they tell us what we want to emulate. They tell us what we want to be like, who we want to surround ourselves with. So for American Vogue or for Elle, I'll say, you know, to make the statement that this is who we want to be. This is what it looks like for us to reach our consumers. This is who they want to see and hear from. I think that would be a really exciting thing. I'll push. I'll do what I can. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
It's such a pleasure. And I think we're all set.
Thank you.
Thank you.